These kids, again, all asymptomatic kids, no pain, did MRIs on their elbow and said, let's see what's going on. This was a study commissioned by the Phillies. They looked at 369 players in their organization, mostly minor leaguers, in that 17 to 21-year-old age group. And what they found there is 30% of those kids, asymptomatic, no pain, no nothing, had basically abnormalities, whether they're calcifications or hypoechoic foci in their elbow. Now, very fancy title, but basically what that means is those guys ended up having some sort of calcium deposit or hardening structure in their UCL. The significance of that is the UCL is basically just like a rubber band. You put something hard inside of a rubber band, you minimize the ability of that rubber band to stretch. If it can't stretch, it loses its ability to absorb torque when it's stretched. The reason that becomes important is your UCL is not just a static ligament. It can actually stretch. So it will change nearly up to 20% by the torque that gets placed upon it. So you put something hard in that ligament, bone structure, calcification, what have you, you end up preventing it from being able to stretch to absorb torque that gets placed on it when you throw. Let's look at the major league level. 2019 was a banner year when it comes to UCL surgeries or UCL injuries at the major league level. For the first time in perhaps ever, certainly as far back as we've been able to track on data, 30% of all major league pitchers have torn their UCLs at some point in their pro career. We don't even know, the data's not tracked going back to college, high school. So if 30% of all active major league pitchers have torn their UCL as pros, perhaps the number might be as many as 40% over time if you went back and looked at that historically. Some people like numbers instead of percentages. So at the professional level, that means this year, 230 of MLB pitchers who started on active rosters this year have torn their UCL as pros. And you can look at the data over the last 4 years. So you take a seasoned pro and you say, let's look at what the state of his elbow looks like. So we've already talked about, we know 30% of those pitchers have torn their UCLs. Fully 50% of the guys who remain. So you say, okay, 30% have torn their UCL. They might have damaged UCL. What about the other guys? Well, 50% of those guys, upon MRI, also have significant UCL degeneration or lots of scarring in their UCL, which means they're well on their way. Depending upon how long their career holds, they're likely going to tear their UCLs. So this concept of a crisis, when we first walked into it, we thought that was kind of media hype. You know, all of us, for those guys who grew up in the north, you know, weatherman predicts you're going to have 12 inches of snow and you get an inch. That's kind of the way I thought UCLs worked. Same thing, you know, people were talking about this as a crisis as if it was overblown. We looked at this, and I think in many ways the concept crisis might be understated when you start looking at UCL tears. We talked not too long ago with the strength coach of one major league organization, and we were talking with him about our device, extremely interested, and his comment to us was, well, yeah, but that's true, but it's really only an American problem, because we have guys from overseas, whether they be from Latin America or from Japan, and those guys, they don't really tear their UCLs as much, right? Well, the data say just the opposite. In fact, from all of the studies that have been done, if you look at the empirical data, that would suggest that guys from Latin America and Japan are tearing their UCLs not as much, but more frequently even than the American guys do. Think about this from a purely economic, sometimes I tend to approach these problems and I say sort of money's the answer, what's the question? So if you look at this from an organizational level or at the macro level and you say, what's the cost to baseball? At the macro level, Major League Baseball right now is losing about $150 million a year from guys who are damaging their UCL, unable to throw. I don't know about you, but you know, I'm an owner, I have that kind of money invested. I've got to figure out a way to solve this problem if I can do anything to put a dent into it. There's again this common perception We had an individual from Run Pro organization today come by, stopped at our booth, and we had a wonderful discussion with him. And his comment was he's constantly hearing about guys who are even showing up in doctors' offices asking doctors to perform surgery because they know they can throw harder if they just go have the surgery. We'll address that myth in just a bit, but the point here is from the actual studies that have been done, very alarming fact, we've had several hundred of you stop by. We did kind of a 10-question quiz on UCLs just to get people's understanding of what's going on. The harsh reality is, as a pro pitcher, you tear your UCL, only 2/3 of pro pitchers who tear their UCLs actually return to throw in at least 10 games. And of those 2/3 that come back, 50% of those guys end up back on the injured list or the DL within 2 years from elbow-related injuries. So then you say, what's the real rate of return from someone tearing a UCL in Major League Baseball? Probably going to be in the neighborhood of 50%. Velocity. There's this myth amongst a lot of people that you tear your UCL, you go have a surgery, you come back, you throw harder. There's no question, guys who come back and throw harder, those guys who do so, the research would say they're not coming back and throwing harder because the surgery enabled them to throw harder. They're coming back to throw harder because they were fortunate enough to find guys who really understand rehab and they can teach people how to improve their mechanics to throw more effectively. But that's not a function of a surgery that does that. That does that because guys have figured out how to throw more effectively to produce velocity in a safer manner. So, we talk about this when it comes to high school and college guys. Not too long ago, we had a conversation with one major league scout from a very prominent historic organization that's probably had as much success in Major League Baseball as any organization in the history of baseball. Probably wouldn't be too hard for you guys to figure out which organization that might be. His comment to us was, right now, they won't even look at a kid to put any serious money into that's had Tommy John surgery as a high school kid or early in their college career, because their view is there's only a limited life from that second repair. So at the high school level, collegiate level, I mean, guys who aspire to play at a high level obviously should, in addition to obviously avoiding the recovery necessary and the loss of a year to 2 seasons to recover, the impact that places or the ceiling that a UCL surgery could place on their career is obviously traumatic. Which led Dr. Chris Ahmad from the Yankees to make this statement, which obviously everyone can relate to, which is the problem's severe. We need to do whatever we can to find a problem, and today no one has a solution. So before we touch upon our device, and Adam will address some of that towards the end, I want to talk I want to talk a little bit just about why throwing causes tears. So in one simple word, I think the take-home message for anyone who wants to understand what's happening when you tear your UCL or why the UCL tears, we can answer it in one word: torque. It really becomes that simple. If we say torque is the problem, then we need to understand which torque, when, where. And the first thing we need to understand is where maximum torque applies. And maximum torque gets applied at the point of external rotation, which is, some people refer to that as layback. When you're most laid back, that transition from max layback to transition into moving forward is the point at which torque is the greatest. Now, torque at that point becomes a problem. Thank you. Torque at that point becomes a problem because if you look at tears, when surgeons are doing tears, what they are finding that 76%, so basically 3/4 of everyone with tears, has these calcifications that have developed over a lifetime of throwing that actually makes the UCL less resistant to the torque that gets placed upon it. So there's this myth that exists when it comes to UCL tears. You hear people all the time, my arm was perfectly healthy, I threw a pitch, when I threw it I heard this pop, my UCL destroyed, as if you've gone from perfect health to destroyed UCL in one pitch. The reality is UCL tears or a chronic injury built over a lifetime of throwing. To understand what's happening when it comes to UCL tears, we need to do kind of a quick anatomy lesson. So first off, you look at the UCL. The UCL attaches